Hello, everyone, and happy International Translation Day. My name is Tanner, and this is second of this podcast. And yeah, today, so it's going to be all about translation and anything that has to do with it, really, whatever comes up. Yeah, we're going to have a guest on, um, but just real quick, just want to introduce this. A lot of people that don't understand the industry. It's a very commonly misunderstood industry, even though people think they know what translation is. A lot of people maybe think it's switching words from one language to another, but it's really more than that. This industry is more in depth than you realize. There's a lot more to translation than just looking the words up or whatever. So yeah, I'm excited for today and hoping educate people and get people to understand this industry more. All right, so we want to bring our guest, Lennon Sperry from Dark Pixel Digital, also a creator of the YouTube series Lost in Translation. How are you doing, Lennon?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thank you for being here. So, do you want to start off by talking about the YouTube series you have, Lost in Translation? Why did you start it, and just talk about what it's about?
Well, okay, so Lost in Translation is a series that I started because doing YouTube, YouTube really likes content that you can, I don't know, you can put out more frequently. They don't like people that make one or two videos like a year.
Yeah.
And so with our business, since we do a lot of YouTube stuff, we were brainstorming different interesting ways to make things that could be made more often than our older content, which was usually visual effects and stuff that took a long time to make. So, you know, video games and that sort of thing does really well on YouTube. There's a large audience for that. But
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to just make a show about video games.
Yeah.
I felt like there's a more interesting angle that we could find there with Japanese video games specifically, since there's so many popular ones and people know a lot about Japanese video games. In fact, usually people all they know about Japan is through something like video games.
Yeah.
So I figured it was a really good opportunity to talk about that, but not there. There are other shows on YouTube that do a similar kind of thing, but most of them are a little more pop culture oriented in the sense that they want, obviously a large audience, the biggest audience possible. So they'll talk about a lot of surface level type stuff and a lot of really, really interesting things. But I actually wanted to take a little more of like a sociological, anthropological approach to Japanese culture. And so usually they'll talk about a game that has some aspect of Japanese culture that either went into its development or translation or whatever, and I'll kind of break it down into a concept from there, and then I'll just talk about the concept instead of just a video game. So because I love video games, but I I get a little bit more out of actually talking about the culture in kind of a more serious way, I guess.
Yeah, they're definitely very interesting videos, and they actually do cover a wide range of subjects, but they also do go pretty deep into each uh, subject. So now you've been to Japan and you
Yeah.
you speak some Japanese. Uh, so what have you learned when it comes to just this whole Japanese culture, Japanese language versus American culture, and English language um, as you've been working on these videos?
Yeah, well, I've learned a lot working on the videos. See, I thought I already knew a lot about that going in, like, because I was a missionary in Japan for 2 years, and so I felt like, yeah, I've lived there for 2 years. I've talked to thousands of people.
Hmm.
I have a pretty good feel for what they like, what they don't like, what their motivations are, those kinds of things. But I've kind of found as I started researching, because like I said, each video centers around a topic. When I was working on, I think it was the first big one that I did was about collectivism, because there's this idea that like Asian cultures are very collectivist and that Western cultures are very individualistic.
Mm-hmm.
And so, since that's such a popular notion, I decided I would just talk about that. And as I started researching, I ran across more and more information that contradicted what I had thought before. And I started to realize, like, oh my gosh, like, I thought I had a pretty good grasp of the subject, but I really only had like a surface level understanding of it. I didn't have a really deep understanding of it with all the nuances and everything. And that's kind of why the show goes a little deeper, because it kind of goes beyond what you would normally expect from a show about Japan. There's a lot of shows about Japan that'll kind of say the same things, the same
Yes.
popular ideas of what Japan is like, or what they're motivated by, kind of how their society functions. And so, like with the collectivism one, I started realizing that Japanese people in some ways are more collectivist than Americans, but in other ways they're actually more individualistic than Americans.
Do you
Like,
have an
for
example?
example,
Yeah.
college student. There was a survey. I forget the university, but there's a survey of college students in Japan, and those Japanese students ranked as more individualistic on the scale than the same survey that was given to American college students. They ranked more collectivist than the Japanese students did. So, it's easy sometimes to want to explain parts of our culture by just saying, like, oh yeah, you know how these people are, and everyone feels like they have an understanding of, oh, this is what, all the stereotypes you run into about Japanese people being hardworking or good at math, or just smarter, or that they only care about their families, or those stereotypes. It's not like they're necessarily negative stereotypes, but they're not necessarily true. And so as I dove a little more into the subject, and I started realizing, like, there's a little more to collectivism specifically, and I started to realize, like, man, everything else I think I understand about Japan, even having lived there, I probably am misunderstanding. So for every subject I went to from that point on, I tried to take a fresh approach to it, and just not. I don't ever create an episode based on things I already know. I might have an idea for an episode based on things I already know, but every episode I start the research from the ground level up, and that, for one, makes sure that I'm actually correct when I'm saying things. But for another, it's really for me because I'm interested in it, so I learn a lot through that process. So I'll make pages and pages of notes about whatever the subject may be, and then I have to whittle those notes down into a narrative and an interesting script. And so, like, I've had 20 plus pages of notes before that I've got to pare down into. Usually the video scripts, I do them as Google Docs. They're usually only like 5 or 6 pages long. So I have a lot of information that I need to condense down. And so a lot of things end up getting dropped that I still think are interesting, but just don't work with the flow of the video. They're just random facts and things sometimes. Yeah, so I've enjoyed this series because I've learned a lot more about Japan through the series, because I'd never taken a serious, besides studying the language, I'd never taken a serious, like, academic approach to learning about Japanese culture. It was all just pop culture. It was like I'd seen movies and talked to people,
Yeah. So,
So
this is the episode for International Translation Day, and along with translation is localization, which is the adaptation and translation of a product. And so your series really dives into not just translation; it's mostly localization. That cultural aspect. So
yeah,
can you
yeah,
explain there some maybe an example?
yeah. Oh man, an example. So yeah, especially in the world of video games, surprisingly, people who are really, really into video games are very aware of localization as an idea, as opposed to translation. I think your average person is not very aware of localization as an idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like someone who maybe hasn't studied another language very extensively, or
culture.
isn't
Yeah,
isn't into some subculture that gets into that kind of thing, or if it's not their job, I don't think most
right.
people think about that
Yeah.
uh, on a daily basis. A lot of people just think you can just translate. What did they say?
Mm-hmm.
And I've done like translation for people like um, where I have to obviously try to localize, but the problem is if they don't trust you, because you're getting the voice of the author uh, in the destination language, like in English in my case, like you're getting the voice of the author coming through, um, of the author of the translation as opposed to like the original author, if that makes sense. Like sometimes you just have to accept the fact that this person's going to have to take some creative liberties to make something make sense, and it's not literally
Right.
what the other person said,
Mm-hmm.
but you're matching the tone and the concept and the context, and that's what's important. But there are people that get upset about that, even in the video game community. There's people that get mad because they
You're not
feel
saying it the
like,
same way. Yeah.
exactly, they feel like, oh, this is not the word they use. So like sometimes people will take a translation or a localized script, and they'll go back as they learn Japanese and they start learning, oh my gosh, they
This
said
is
something
wrong.
completely different here in Japanese. This is wrong. This translation's wrong. Yeah, but it's like oftentimes, no, that doesn't mean it's wrong. If it still got the same feeling and idea across and it didn't feel out of place, then it wasn't wrong. So,
Yeah.
yeah, we talk a lot about localization in like works of fiction and things like that. Not as much about localization in like the business world, so to speak. That kind of thing. Um, but yeah, it's just interesting with people who are into video games. They tend to be more aware of it and uh,
Mm-hmm.
and get upset about it sometimes. I'm trying to think of like a real good example of something that I think was localized really well. The problem with that is it's like editing. It's like if like in movies, in film, if there was a good editor, you don't notice because the editing was good, and so it
Mm-hmm.
didn't get in the way and it didn't stand out, and so you didn't notice. It was kind of invisible, so to speak. So I think a good localization is invisible. Like you don't notice a good one because there was nothing that stuck out like a sore thumb, right?
Right.
And so sometimes it's like the people who do that work are unsung heroes because nobody realizes what went in to to doing the job that they did. And it used to be that nobody cared because nobody understood.
Mm-hmm.
And as time went on, people have realized you can't just do that. There's no language is one to one. There's not like all the same words in this language are all in this language and they all mean the exact same thing in the same context. It's like, no, they don't. And like I remember when I first started learning Japanese, and I remember learning this word's this word's this, and because at the time I was training to leave on a mission to Japan, and so sometimes we would ask our teachers how to say certain phrases we were interested in saying, and a lot of them were like colloquialisms or things that we would say to kind of maybe like tease each other or whatever. And I remember asking, how do you say that someone's crazy? Because in English you might say, oh, you're crazy, you're crazy. Well, in Japanese, that's actually pretty insulting. Like, you wouldn't do that. You wouldn't call someone crazy, but they were like, well, you could say kuru kuru pa, which is like the wheels turning, kuru kuru kuru, because Japanese has all these onomatopoeias, kuru kuru, and then the pa is like pop, like almost explodes or it goes wrong, and so it's like the wheels turning in someone's head and then just brink, and something pops out, and so they're crazy, right? Like things aren't working right, like something popped in their brain. And so, like, technically, yeah, it would mean that someone's crazy, but it doesn't mean that the same way that you use it in English,
Mm-hmm.
It's like, so I ran into a lot of that stuff early on, but it just took me years and years, really, before I realized that, like, man, it just doesn't work that way. Um, you can't just be like, well, I say this word all the time in this language. What's the word for that in that language? And I'm just going to start saying that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Uh,
it's fun because there's a lot of flexibility there, and I think that like I said, it allows the person doing the localization some degree of freedom. Like you're getting that person's imagination along with their ability to translate, right?
mhm. Alrighty. Well, thanks for your time. Again,
Yeah.
I will post a link to the YouTube videos we're referring to. Also, there's some podcasts where Lennon and the other members of Dark Pixel cover topics of translation. So
Yeah.
thanks again for joining us, Lennon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're
This was
welcome.
fun.
Bye. Wow, it's good stuff. Covered a lot more than I expected. Yeah, so if a quick example of what he's talking about there, here in Spanish is if you were to say I am 15, which I'm not by the way, but just an example, I am 15, it would be tengo 15 años, and that literally means I have 15 years. So if you were to try and do it literally and say I have, yo soy or estoy, that wouldn't make sense to that Spanish speaking listener quite as much as, or maybe at all, as much as using tengo, I have. So that's basically it. In the future, we'll be covering translation here and there, definitely. And be covering other topics, like linguistics and learning languages. And so that's about it for today. Hope you have a wonderful day.